we are talking about the need and limits of psychological safety. So let me start with, first of all, a story. And I was working with an executive team, and I've been working with them for a few sessions. And we got to this topic of psychological safety. And I had had them fill out an instrument, a brief 5 to 10 question instrument. And interestingly, one of the questions was about how comfortable do you feel about raising sensitive issues, difficult topics? And on a score of 5, they averaged a 4. That's an executive team of about, a dozen people. And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." And because I'd been working with them for some time, I said, "Well, your results here are interesting because it's not it's a little lower than your other scores. The two you folks gave yourselves a collective 2 out of 5. Um, so I was wondering if there's anything you want to talk about, if there's anything, what makes it hard to talk about certain sensitive topics?" And nothing was said. I waited because, I'm trained as a middle school teacher. I know how to wait, so I'm waiting. And there's silence, and there's silence, and there's silence. I said, "Oh, well, let me rephrase the question." I rephrased it. Does anyone have anything to add? I add again at the end of my rephrase. And again, there's silence, and there's silence, and there's silence. And I'm like, "Oh, well," I said, "in my work, it feels like we've hit an edge, and I'm not sure what the edge is." And it's interesting that people don't want to name that. I was like, "Okay, well, I mean, this is here. We're going to move on to something else, but I'm just aware that something happened here. I'm not sure what it is." Okay. Um, I think that was the last time I saw them. And there were some cancellations, this kind of stuff. And then about 2 months later, uh, in the newspaper, I hear that that same organization, there's a investigation happening. And this investigation is actually launched by some members of the team against other members of the team. I was like, "Whoa, that's really interesting." And the um, uh, the head of the organization was also implicated in that. And I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting. At the end of that process, uh, when the investigation was done, one of the things that came up really strongly was that there was a culture of fear, and there was very low psychological safety. Okay. Now, frequently whenever I've seen organizations hit the news where the human rights case or discrimination or something like that, 9 times out of 10, when an investigation comes out, it frequently says that same thing, that, "Oh, there's a culture of fear. There's an absence of psychological safety." That's an extremely, unfortunately, common thing amongst organizations. So that's story number one. And so there's a real need to talk about psychological safety and its importance. Now, let me go to the another end of the spectrum. Uh, Not too long ago, I was talking to a professor at a university, and they said to me, Shakil, I want to know, um, what do I say when a student or a group of students comes and says, even before things have, gotten very far in my course, that, and there's a demand that says, like, "Well, what are you going to do to make this course psychologically safe for me?" And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." That's happening quite a lot, especially in post-secondary. But that's another end of the thing where there's like demands for psychological safety. And like, what are you going to do to make me feel safe? So I raise that because both of these dimensions are misunderstandings of what is psychological safety and what's possible in the context of workplaces or education spaces around psychological safety. Okay, so that's what this session is going to be about. Okay, so let's now jump into what is psychological safety. Okay, now psychological safety is fundamentally, it refers to the ability of a workplace team for team members to raise concerns and question and challenge ideas, even unpopular ones, as well as admit to mistakes without the fear of humiliation or retaliation um, by supervisors or their peers. This is what psychological safety refers to in the workplace. It means you can say things, you can talk about things, you can challenge one another, you can show up as your whole self, and you should not be penalized for it. Okay. Now, interestingly, psychological safety also is the number one factor. High psychological safety is the number one factor in high performing teams. That's what all the research says over and over again. So you want high performance, you got to be able to have an environment psychologically safe. Why? Because it's an environment in which people are willing to take risks. They're willing to own up to their mistakes and find new solutions and be creative. Psychological safety is also absolutely foundational for equity, diversity, and inclusion success inside organizations. So that's the linchpin between high performance and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, psychological safety is not the same thing as safe space. Safe space is something unique to vulnerable groups requiring a refuge because of violence or abuse. Okay? Safe space is what a gay nightclub would have been and this is where the term came from, in the 60s and 70s, where it was completely unsafe for gay people to even congregate. It was against the law to be in homosexual relationships. It was illegal in many parts of Canada and the US to even hold hands if you're of the same sex. Okay, so that's a context in which the term safe space emerged from. Safe space also was a context used by early feminists in the 60s and 70s when they were doing consciousness raising programs with other women inside living rooms. It was a place where people could come and talk about their issues and not be judged, but be heard and understood and validated. Okay. And so safe space is really, I mean, it's still around today. It's really important today as well for lots of minoritized groups. But a safe space is not something that really exists in a workplace. That's not what a workplace is meant to do. And because of our lack of literacy in this work, our lack of emotional literacy, we've kind of mulched all these concepts together. We're using them in places where it's just not appropriate. And I say that with someone who's also trained in trauma therapy. Like, I went to figure out trauma therapy because I was like, people are, I'm sure, using these words in the wrong way, so I'm going to go and understand what the hell this is about. Okay. So, psychological safety is not the same as therapy because a workplace is not a therapeutic space. And again, these ideas get confused together. Psychological safety is required and essential when we are learning about equity, diversity, and inclusion. We need a psychologically safe space to both learn and unlearn the habits that perpetuate systemic forms of discrimination like racism and sexism. So we've got to really bring in a resiliency focus and not mush these things together. In EDI work, we have to expect discomfort in learning. Okay, if you're learning about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's going to be uncomfortable if you have dominant identities, because we're going to talk about whiteness, we're going to talk about sexism. It's going to make people feel uncomfortable. It's also going to be uncomfortable for members who are non-dominant groups, because we're going to be exploring things that are challenging, that maybe touch on some of your experiences, and that might not feel comfortable either. But we have to distinguish when we're learning from education space from therapeutic space. And when we're learning, it's an education space. That is a place in which we're going to be imperfect. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say the wrong things. We're going to use the wrong words. But we have to do that in the context of learning. Okay? Now, the thing here is that because of the way people have been socialized in racial justice and activism, we've kind of confused discomfort for harm. Discomfort and harm are two very different things. And if we mush everything together, if everything is harmful, then nothing is harmful. If everything is abusive, then nothing is abusive. We've lost our ability to discern. We've lost our ability to differentiate. And that doesn't help anybody. It especially doesn't help people who are the most marginalized. We can build towards inclusion in a workplace. And the greater levels of inclusion we have in a workplace, the greater levels of psychological safety. That's appropriate for a workplace. But an inclusive workplace is still not a therapeutic space. And we have to make the distinction between these two. The key to this is also providing choices, because here's the thing. Choices are essential in this work. Okay. What I mean by choices is that the possibility of harm increases when we are put in situations where we just can't get out of them. I have to sit through someone saying things that are triggering things for me in the past. I have to sit through language that is really not, it's beyond comfortable for me. Okay. And so if I have to sit through that kind of stuff, that's where harm might actually play out. So what do you do about that? In Anima Leadership, we provide choices when we're learning. And also in workplaces, we can provide certain kinds of choices. What I mean by choices is providing choices for self-care. Okay? So in an Anima training, we'll always say, hey, look, we trust you know how to look out for yourself. We know that you will take the risks you need to take, and you'll also erect some boundaries that you need to erect. And a risk-taking is the idea of like asking a question, trying on a new idea, challenging somebody. Those are all things you can do in a learning space and in a workplace if it's psychologically safe. A boundary is you can just listen. You can pass when it's your turn. You can step out of the room when it gets to be too big for you and you're starting to dysregulate. I trust you know how to look after yourself. I trust that you will turn off your screen if we're online. I trust that you'll go for a walk, or maybe walk down some stairs, or maybe go outside and get some air, maybe get water and help shift your state. I trust that you know how to do that, and you'll come back when you're ready. Okay. So self-care, you encourage self-care. You encourage that. Someone has to be in something that goes from being uncomfortable into something that might actually be harming, because it's actually touching something very deep and wounding inside of us. Okay. Now, the other thing is that at Anima, we do things like, hey, we'll also give you an option. When we're doing a deep diversity leadership training, we'll say, hey, look, if there's a BIPOC group, if you want to participate in that because you feel more comfortable doing more shorthand, great. Sometimes we've had a queer-focused group. Sometimes we've had a group of people with disabilities. It's option. We don't tell people to go into them, but if people want them, there's enough people, we'll create them. That's no problem. That's legitimate for a learning space. Okay. And in workplaces, it's legitimate to have affinity groups, because sometimes you just need to talk about your work in a context where you're just surrounded by women, or just surrounded by people of color, or just surrounded by people who share whatever part of your identity that's relevant. That helps. Okay. So choice is what can help us in these situations. And again, therapeutic space, we're in a workplace. It's not that. We're in an education space. It's not a therapeutic space. So really important. Now, so all of that's really important. So what are the things that you can do? And especially if you're in a leadership position, what are things that leaders can do? Well, first of all, this work around even developing a psychologically safe space, differentiating safe space from therapeutic space, drawing boundaries, honoring people's experiences, increasing, all of that has to do with you developing your emotional literacy skills, you developing your capacity for emotions, you developing your own self-awareness, noticing what's happening for you while it's happening. Okay, and there's lots of ways to do that. I'm just giving you the headlines here. Also in this work, your own equity, diversity, and inclusion literacy matters. Your awareness of power dynamics matters. And in deep diversity, if you've reviewed the training with us, we've, through our research, come up with 360 hours as your benchmark to achieve a basic level of comfort, a basic level of proficiency around this topic of EDI. Okay. 3, what can leaders do? Now you got to also role model the behaviors that support psychological safety. This is absolutely essential. Please, 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 people. Here. Look, I'm taking my glasses off for this one. Please, please, do not tell people that this is psychologically safe space. Don't do that. Don't tell them this is psychologically safe space. But model it. Model it through your actions and then talk about it. Okay? If you're saying, hey, we're psychologically safe space, people are like, oh, they might say or do something and you aren't prepared because you actually were just talking out your butt. Not okay. All right. So there are things you can do here that are absolutely essential. Okay. First of all, the foundation of this stuff is learning to give and receive feedback skillfully, both formal and informal. Creating a feedback-rich environment is absolutely essential in this work. Most people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to give feedback. They don't know how to receive feedback. And that is part of the problem. That's why performance appraisals are done so badly. That's why no one looks forward to performance appraisals, because they're done badly. Because performance appraisals are just really a formalized way at the end of the year of giving feedback that you should have been given all year long anyway. Constructive feedback, feedback that's positive. Here's what I think you're doing well. Constructive feedback that includes, here's the things I think you need to improve on. Opportunities to say, hey, what did we learn through this last project? What went well, what didn't go well? From both the individual to the collective level. This is essential. We do a lot of this work in our authentic management course that I'll talk about at the end, as well as our Brave Conversations course. But it is foundational. The other part about this is you absolutely, especially in leadership positions, you do not retaliate when you receive feedback that is unfavorable, that is unpopular, that is about you and your leadership. You never retaliate. You say, thank you, that's really helpful. I'm going to sit and think about that for a while. I might have to come back to you to ask some questions because it's a lot to take in one sitting. But I appreciate you having the guts to tell me, who's your manager, that I don't want to underestimate that. Okay? Because it's a big risk when someone is giving feedback up. That's really tough. So that's where psychological safety is essential. It also is required laterally, but it's super important now. Okay, what else can you do? Well, your policies matter, and your transparency with your policies matter. Policies and supports regarding anti-harassment, anti-discrimination. What's your conflict management strategy when I actually am in conflict with my manager? Who do I go to now? What's the explicit chain? If you don't know that, you've reduced psychological safety. What about mental health supports? Where do I go to, or where do people go to when they need mental health supports in your organization? How does that work? Okay. Now, in doing these four things, then you're much likely to be able to do the fifth thing, which is establishing your limits. When you are able to help your team and your peers distinguish what's a workplace and what's a therapeutic space. When are we in a context where we're learning about psychological concepts because it's an education piece that we're doing versus that suddenly slides into therapy? It's not. You've got to be able to keep those things separate and clean. And the inability to do that is part of the challenge. Also, thinking about when your coaching hits its limits. Like there's a reality that you may be coaching an employee and that coaching works really well with some employees. It really does not work well with other employees. And you might start noticing that in spite of the coaching, something is getting in the way. Well, you hit your limit and you're like, I don't know if my coaching is helping that much. I'm noticing the same patterns are playing out. We've had this discussion multiple times. Um, you may want to consider that we have other therapeutic supports that are here because I'm here to coach. I'll be here to support, but I also know my limits, these kinds of things. So it's really important that you got to know what your limits are. And most managers aren't great coaches, but some can be, and you can train yourself to be, and you can take courses that can help you with that as well. Okay, so those are five things you can do, and James will drop this into the whole deck into the chat anyway. Okay, so I am I'm gonna pause there, and we're gonna just do a quick little reflection, and I'm gonna turn it over to you folks. First of all, what's helpful from today about psychological safety? What did you find useful? What was an insight? What was an aha? Okay. Put something in the chat. Take a moment and don't hit return yet. Just take a moment and reflect on what was helpful from today, what was useful. And then we'll also do a section on questions and comments and clarifications and disagreements. That's also fine too. But let's first just talk what was helpful, what was useful for today. And then whenever you're ready, you can hit return. What was helpful? And while comments are coming in, I'd also love to hear some voices. What did you find that was helpful? Um, and we'll get to questions and comments in the second part of this, but let's just do what was helpful. Let's hear from you. Even if you've written something in the chat, expand on what you've written. Jump in, folks.
Hi, Shakil and everyone. My name's Kristen. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining from the territory, pardon me, of the Coast Salish people. What I really appreciate, Shakil, is how you clarified the difference between discomfort and harm. Because I think that, yeah, I won't go into it, but it really resonated for me. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Great. You can see other thumbs up. This frequently happens in post-secondary, frequently happens in not-for-profit section movements and things like that, grassroots organizations. You can see that happens a lot because people care and want to do the work right, but it can get all complicated. Other comments? Yeah, thank you. Patty Ann, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patty Ann. My pronouns are she, her. I actually have a follow-up. I had written down, or I put in the chat, discomfort is not harm. And then it occurred to me as I was listening to Kristen present it, what if the person you're connecting with is considering that it is harm? And I know, you said don't retaliate, so I guess it would be taking it in, but thinking of impact versus intent. So if I'm perceiving something as a discomfort potential and the recipient's perceiving it as harm, I guess any tips, thoughts, that's all.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that one, Patty Ann, okay? I'm putting it in here just so we don't lose it. We'll come back to that. I think I saw your hand, Keely.
Yeah, hi. I really appreciate related to, distinguishing between discomfort and harm, also those boundaries and giving people choice. And I appreciated how you talked about at Anima, like that's an act of trust in people. Like I trust you to make the choice that's right for you and to take care of yourself. And I think that's a, a sort of discourse or narrative that we don't always hear in this space. So it feels very empowering. And the other thing is emotional literacy coming up a lot. We all need to build up our emotional literacy, and understanding the difference between these things is a big part of that. So thanks.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Um, I'm glad that resonated for you for sure. Jess, I see your hand.
Hey folks. Um, Jess here calling in from Ballotine. I think my question is, I like the distinction that you're making between a therapeutic space and a workplace. And feel free to come back to this, but my question is, can you expand a little bit on what is a therapeutic space when I feel like the lines get blurred when you're working with your own people. And there's like trauma bonding that actually happens within the workplace, or like the safety that's actually created within the workplace really blurs that line when you're working with your own people. And so if you have any thoughts about that, or to go deeper into a little bit of a therapeutic space versus workplace, because I actually see that the boundaries are so essential but are often missing. And so we then move into a place where folks are like actually not able to reach their potential within the workplace because it's sort of almost too therapeutic. Yeah. So anyway, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. So then what I'll also do right now, because we've moved in that direction, you're welcome. There's lots of other things that are here that are positive. I'm going to go over them. I'm also going to invite right now other questions you might have, because I've got a couple questions I've written in, but let's add other questions. So right now I'm going to read through just some of the other things that stood out for people. Things like recognizing your coaching limits, the workplace and therapeutic space, helped a lot of people, safe space and psychological safety, boundary setting, hearing the modeling of the language, key skills for leaders. So lots of things that have come up. So that's great. You can see those themes. So any other questions you have, because then I'll take those, and then I've got one more little, I've got to share a couple of things with you, and then I'm going to take all the questions. So take a moment and hit any other questions, and I'll also take some voices in the questions front, and then I'm going to try to merge them into a couple of responses. Okay. Now, what if the person you're talking to considers what you said harmful? Well, that's a really good question. There's not one answer to that. What matters is the context. What is the context within which that is being said? What is the relationship within that is being said? It's different if my friend says it to me, who I don't work with. It's going to be a very different conversation than when I'm with a colleague. Okay. What I'm going to say to my colleague versus what I'm going to say to my friend is going to be dependent on the relationship and what is in the workplace. If I'm a manager, it could be any number of things. I might say something like, wow, I'm so sorry that landed like that on you. I can see the impact was not at all what I intended. I'll be more thoughtful about my language. Or what would be more useful? Right? As a leader, particularly, I really want to try to work with the broadest spectrum of people. I'm going to do my best to work with that. At the same time, there may be competing needs, and I'll have to deal with the competing needs at the same time. So there's not one answer. It really is. But this is where we get stuck. There isn't one answer, yet we treat this conversation like there is one, and there's a correct one for every situation. There must be a right answer. There is not a right answer. What's right in one will be wrong in another. Do your best to be humble. Do your best to focus on impact as well as intent. and do your best to work with language that the person is saying, might be more helpful for them. You might disagree, and that's okay too. And that disagreement happens within the context of what that relationship is. Was this an off-the-cuff comment at lunch? Is this in the context of our teams? What is this about? So I can't give you one answer, but the only universality is that there is no universal answer. You have to go context by context. Okay. What is a therapeutic space? A therapeutic space is where there's a therapist. That's what a therapeutic space is. It's a therapist is there. Whether it's free or you're shelling out big bucks on your own, there's therapy happening. There's someone who's qualified. Most environments are not that. Yet weirdly, because we've developed, and there's a whole other conversation, we've developed more cognition around these issues than we have actually around skills and emotions. Our emotional awareness is very limited compared to our cognitive analysis. So as a result, all these ideas get mashed up. And academics and an overly academic framing of a lot of this stuff is part of the problem. And just even sometimes saying this alone, we say this in our trainings, this is a learning space. This is not a therapeutic space. The very things I just talked to you about, that distinction itself are like people like, oh, okay, I trust you to look after yourself. We're already priming the field where people are going to touch their resources rather than their victimhood. As opposed to where a lot of the work around justice is done, it's framed around, let me protect you because I know better than you, and I want to protect you because I think you're a victim. Like, no, not in a learning space, not in a workplace. We have to show up with adult education principles. We've got to show up respecting people and not making assumptions, but making these distinctions. Sometimes just even those distinctions is helpful. And for sure, like there's no reason not to talk about hardships that we've gone through. And in certain relationships, that's going to be fine. But to believe that that is the only way to be appropriate in the workplace, that's part of the problem, because here's what happens. There is such a thing as, well, I don't want to call it, it's like a distorted sense of psychological safety, a misinterpretation of safe space. And then what happens is that people's really weird behavior starts coming out. Like all their bad behavior starts coming out. And okay, I'm not looking at anybody. Happens a lot with people who are working in mental health stuff. Social workers, I'm looking at you. No, I'm not looking at you really. It happens frequently with people who are in the helping fields on these actual things. They are some of the ones who make those distinctions in the workplace with their teams. They mess it up. I see it. I'm like, people, you should know this better, but their boundaries, people aren't talking about their boundaries in a healthy way. Healthy boundaries is very important. Just like developing EDI knowledge is important. You can't do this without a knowledge of equity, diversity, inclusion. Otherwise, they'll have a one-sided way. What I don't want people to do is say, okay, people, this is not a therapeutic space. That's what I heard Shakil say. And so we're not going to talk about anything. Right? That's also not the message. To be our whole selves, to be able to talk about our lives, to talk about our challenges, as what it means is to be a colleague. All that is part of it, right? I got to be able to say, you know what, that issue that just happened in the world actually really affects me, and I'm a little messed up by it. That's legit. That's not therapeutic. That's just owning how I'm feeling. I can be a good listener when someone's saying that. I don't have to do more than that. Learn to be good listeners and speaking from the heart are skills we don't nurture enough. But speaking from the heart does not mean I have to blow up into my deepest trauma, but that's what's going to happen if you don't lay some limits out for people. Okay. So that's, again, I'm giving sort of like starting points to these answers. I don't have they're not full answers. But that's a couple starting points. I do see a hand, Gulnaz.
Hi, Shakil. Thank you so much for this. There's a comment in the chat that I'm curious about as well from
Yeah.
Catherine around curiosity about navigating white fragility within this context. And I asked this question, are you aware of any research that looks at psychological safety when a senior leader is racialized or in that dynamic? And I ask because I've heard numerous stories around, for example, racialized women that are in senior leadership roles, the one and only, who are advocating for DEI, and then more junior white staff say, I don't feel psychologically safe, or even those that may be sitting around a leadership table. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that component.
Yeah. So, I mean, on one level, what you're talking about is just straight up resistance, right? So some of it is just resistance. And resistance is part of the work when we're doing equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our job is to lower the resistance. Our job is to get leaders to wake up. Our job is to help develop that literacy. Okay. Now, when I say our job, it doesn't mean it's just your specific job, because you need educators who are going to come in and work. You need leadership folks that are going to be able to speak your leadership language and get leaders on board. So it's not just up to you, but you've got to be resourceful enough to be able to manage upwards and sideways. Do those things happen? Absolutely, they happen. There's such a thing as too much psychological safety. Too much psychological safety is what is alive most days for leaders who identify as female. It is too much psychological safety is what is alive for most days for leaders who identify as people of color or women of color. Why? Because people feel very safe around saying whatever the hell they want to them and treat them differently than they do their white male colleagues. That's too much psychological safety. We know what too much psychological safety looks like. It looks like lack of boundaries. Okay, so too much psychological safety is what we have been talking about the double standard for women leaders, for leaders of color, for women of color, for men of color, for Indigenous folks who are in leadership positions. They're experiencing other people finding them too psychologically safe, to a point where I'm going to behave with you inappropriately. I'm going to say things around you that I'm not willing to say to other people who happen to be white and male. Okay, so that's a reality. That's too much psychological safety. That's without boundaries. So we got to be able to talk about those things. And it's really hard if it's the only one. And this is, again, part of the thing we do in deep diversity is really talk about patterns. We've got to help leaders recognize those patterns, that when there's just the one woman or the one person of color, there's going to be patterns around them. If their leadership peers don't know those patterns, then you're isolating that person. You're making it harder for them. You're not being supportive, and you're not creating psychological safety for them. To create full psychological safety, you also have to have an EDI lens. You can create psychological safety for a whole whack of people of white people or a whole whack of men, but creating high performing diverse teams, that's way harder, because you've got to have EDI under your belt, as well as emotional literacy, as well as your ability to create psychological safety. Okay. Does that help? Does that help, Gulnaz? Okay. And if you looked, I'm sure there's research out there that will be talking about these things, right? Did I miss anything in the chat, people, that anyone wants to respond to? I think I tried to get to everything. I'm going to take a look here again. Thank you, Jessica, about the shout out about Brave Conversations. That's great. Oh, okay. So I see, Kristen, how do you feel about trigger warnings in learning spaces? I'm a bit mixed on it, because I find sometimes trigger warnings are just, they make us more fragile. At other times, I think it's really appropriate, because we're actually going to show something that's really hard and difficult. But it seems like there's a way in which if we don't draw the boundaries, then it feels like everything needs a trigger warning, and I don't think everything does because we're in a learning space. At the same time, I think some things do, right? Like if I'm going to be, if an instructor, for example, for really useful reasons, not just, you know, some kind of uh, some kind of desire just to show random things. Like if you're looking at graphic images for a very specific educational purpose, whether it's images of the Holocaust, whether it's images of other kinds of human brutality, lynchings, things like that. Like, first of all, I think educators need to really be thoughtful about why am I showing certain things. But if I was, and it was at that kind of scale, like if there's a scale of like 8, 9, or 10, on a 1 to 10 scale of like how intense the image might be, well, I do it like we do with movie ratings. It's like an R rating. We're going to hit something's really hard today, but I'm not going to do it for every conversation we're having. That's where the trigger warning is just overused. That I think when it's just used for every little thing, you're reducing its value. Again, if everything is harmful, then really nothing is harmful. If we can't distinguish between this and that, then we've lost something. And we're actually supporting fragility. Just like it's like the same thing around, I don't want to talk about white people. Well, that's a kind of fragility. That's like, well, you need to up your EDI game to be in that conversation. Come on. At the same time, it's like every little word has to be monitored and policed. We're living in a time period where that is impossible to do. We're living in a time period where any issue that is even remotely charged has wrong words associated with it and right words, and you can rarely make all the stakeholders happy. So what do we do? Stop talking about everything? So yeah, I think trigger warnings are appropriate in certain contexts, not as a blanket all statement just because of discomfort. And that's why, again, set the parameters. Where is this going to be? I will provide trigger warnings when we do something and it looks like X, Y, or Z. That's what we'll go. Prior to that, we're in an educational space and make choices. I'm going to support your choices. I'm going to thank you for making choices because remember, your risk taking makes the room safe and your boundary setting makes the room safe. Both things are needed, but everything doesn't have to be explicit. I don't have to do it for you. I'm a teacher. I'm a manager, not a therapist. Okay. Jessica.
So very much embracing sort of the freedom and choice as a way for people to look after themselves. What about white-bodied folks absenting themselves out of discomfort, and any ideas about navigating that? And any ideas about navigating that?
So I think some of that is really about our strategies we use. I think we underestimate how easily shame and blame gets activated, especially inside activist organizations. In fact, we frequently underestimate how frequently we're using shame and blame tactics. Like there's again very little focus on, hey, how easily does shame and blame get activated? And what are the things that we just almost intuitively say now that actually are shaming and blaming? So I actually think that the strategies we used to educate people have mostly been mediocre to bad. They really are because they're cognitive, they're academic. Think about all the language we use. If you don't know the language, it's intimidating as hell, right? My daughter is going to school and she doesn't, in her new school, they know what composite and prime numbers are, and she didn't learn that. She's freaking out. She doesn't know what those things mean. It's the same for everybody. We feel isolated. And so what can we do? I think we need better trainings. We need trainings that hold the line on accountability, but also compassion. Deep diversity, the course that's based on my book is based on that. You can take a look at things like Loretta Ross's 5 C's of calling in, right? Like that does that as well. There's places where it's done better. Where white body, like, look, I teach in purple states like Wisconsin and Michigan in the US. Our trainings get like, 8, 9s, and 10s on average across the board. And we know we've got both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals and progressives all sitting in the same room because we can do this work differently. And I'm not saying that to amplify deep diversity, but saying that we've done it not well. So some of the reason white bodies are not wanting to be in the room is because we talk about them as white bodies, not white people, not people that might be learning or being challenged or whatever, because some of us already gone through that and it was okay for us and we're on the other side. But it's like a teacher that, kids that did well become teachers at school and they have a hard time understanding why kids are struggling, right? Well, if you're into equity work, it's because you were the good student. You figured out how to do it and it makes sense to you. Everyone else is like, I don't understand the square root of 25 or 300, 3,125. I don't understand how this works, right? We've made it inaccessible. We've made the cost of entry really high for people, and we need to reduce it. There'll be some people that won't come in the room regardless. And then we're gonna have to work on them in softer ways and other ways. And then we might also have to work with them also with boundaries too, because this is what we expect. This is what behavior is expected here. And that's where performance and all that kind of stuff also comes in. So there's lots of different strategies. I have rarely been in situations in 30 years where people don't want to learn. I've learned over time, my experience teaches me that most people want to do the right thing. We just don't always know how. And our political climate, it makes it even harder to talk. So, there's a lot of responsibility on those of us doing racial justice and equity education to do it better. Okay, my people, it is 12:58. Thank you so much for being here today. If you have any final questions, I'll hang out for a few additional minutes. Otherwise, at this point, we hope to see you next month at the next cafe, which is the 3rd part in the series of compassion and justice leadership. And we also hope that you're put on your calendars our conference, again, free. It'll be running from around noon to 4 every day, EST. And there'll at least be 2 sessions per day, and you can drop in on the ones that make sense to you. And we'll start spreading the word on that in the coming months, but just want to give you the heads up on it now. At this point, unless you've got any questions or comments to hang out with afterwards, we invite you to come off screen and unmute yourselves and just say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
So much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.